Welcome, everyone. My name is Cindy Wagman, and I am the president and CEO of The Good Partnership. We help small charities with their fundraising, everything from strategy and planning to full hands-on implementation. And if you have been following us for a while, you know we do these monthly master classes. Every month, we bring in a different expert to talk about some of the most pressing fundraising issues you have day to day. And it is my true pleasure to welcome Heather Nelson. How do you want to call your company?
What's that? Yeah, my company officially has been named. It's very exciting. Yes, one of the many stories to tell, but yeah, I'm officially the principal owner and consultant of Bridge Raise now, not just Heather Nelson, me.
Excellent. So Heather's, as I said before, a guru in corporate fundraising. And what I love about Heather is that she can relate to organizations of all sizes and has experience across the board. And so she really can take best practices from the big shops and make it translate really well for the small shops. So, and as you know, it's really important for us to speak to the realities of working in small organizations. So Heather, is there anything you want to add before we start talking about maybe that Oprah phenomenon?
No, I think, we should just dive in. I guess the only thing I'd like to say is I'm really hoping to make this useful for the people that are here. So we're going to do our best, obviously, to guess what people want to know, but don't hesitate to ask questions. I know, don't feel shy. It's we're all friends here, so please do, put your questions up there. We'll cover them for sure.
Totally. So type in your questions, Heather. I'll monitor the feed and I will ask you the questions, so you don't have to worry about all the comments or anything.
Okay, great.
And so boards love corporate fundraising. It's definitely valuable for organizations, but not always the top priority. Let's talk a little bit about myth versus reality, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think boards love corporate fundraising for quite a few different reasons. And it is really helpful to know which reason is the particular reason that your board might be mentioning it, because that will really help answer whether it's something that you can practically execute in your shop or not. If it's because they've seen a commercial that that a big charity is doing, and this might be a massive marketing program that they have in place, that might not fit where you're at and might not be realistic, and yet that's the most recent thing they've seen. Other possibilities are that they in their mind want to access funding at their own organizations, and so you don't want to set up a whole program based on one corporate lead. Then it's just about, figuring out how to access or help that one board member access that pool of money, which of course you do want to do, but helpful to unearth that that's really what it's about, not some bigger vision that requires you to do a whole bunch of work. So I really encourage people to ask a lot of questions when they hear that, and not necessarily in the board meeting. It can be in a follow-up call and things like that, to probe further. And then it's also then useful to look at coming back to the board with some information about what might be realistic, so that we can compare, revenue ROI numbers to each other, so that people aren't thinking that, this is a one big check kind of scenario. Yeah. In the worst case, they're actually trying to avoid asking for money themselves.
Yes.
And thinking that, you submitting applications through some granting portal or something is going to get the big win, and they're not going to have to ask themselves. So it could be all or a combination of all these things. And I just think it's a very difficult to be successful at responding to that, phenomenon of the big fancy check coming in based on that topic coming up at a board meeting. So good to delve deeper on that.
I also find that the amount of the donation or the expectation versus what's realistic for small organizations in particular is very skewed, right? Like, you're not, if you're very local, you're not necessarily going to get the same corporate dollars from a national company as a national organization. Like, it's just, they evaluate very differently what they give and how they give it.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is the thing. Corporate sponsorship and corporate revenue of some form can be for everybody, but corporate revenue to a charity is of all types is not available. So it's a question of making sure that you know for where you're at and what you have available, what you can do, what kinds of money you have access to, really, frankly, and to be a small charity, try to access funds that are basically, earmarked for a national corporation, a national charity is just a waste of someone's time. And it's true that a board member who's, not spent the same time evaluating the opportunity may just throw that out as an opportunity.
Yeah. I want, Dorothy, I'm going to come back to your question because it's relevant to one of the next things I want to talk about. But before we move forward, Heather, tell us about your first big corporate partnership. And then after, I want to talk about the difference between partnership, sponsorship, philanthropic gift, etc. But I know you have a great background and can share with us a little bit of your experience in this.
Sure. And what's so funny about my first big corporate gift is it really is the story that I tell everybody not to count on, the dream scenario. So I was at a tiny shop, an organization that actually doesn't even exist anymore, called Street Kids International. So I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but I was the director of development at Street Kids International. And I got a call on my answering machine that was like, I'm calling from a corporation in Europe. We are looking for a partner for like a multi-million-dollar partnership. Call me. Like, and I walked into my executive director's office and I'm like, it's a crank call, right? Did you call me and like leave this message? And he was like, no, you should call back. Find out what it's about. And so I did call back. I had a lovely conversation with a wonderful gentleman from Denmark. And we developed a 3-year, $1.5 million partnership with Echo Shoes at Street Kids International. So I will say that was the start. And while on one side, I will say there was a tad bit of luck involved. On the other side, I will say that what made us ready was that we had done some pretty heavy lifting on the branding side over the previous year, and our website was top notch. And we had a very simple message on the front page. We had compelling photos. We had finally stripped out all the bunk around programming. It was buried deep in the depths of the website, and the front page was clean, story-oriented, bright, and photo driven. And so that's what he said. He's like, we could just picture these pictures along the walk path, and that our attendees would be attracted to this. So so on one hand, I will say that it's not the story that I coach people on. On the flip side, I do say that being open for business, for corporate partnership, does mean that you have some assets that really speak to that kind of audience. And that does tend to be simple message, clear photos, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Clear approach.
I love that story. And I want to emphasize as well that it has as much to do with how you manage that and that relationship, and that they're not just going to see your website and write the check, that was like opening the door, and that you had to move it forward and be open in other ways, right? Be able to deliver other value to companies. So on that note, how do companies give under like what kind of buckets, and how should we think about the value that they're looking for in those areas?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think one of the hardest things when you're talking about corporate money is really knowing from both your side and their side the why of the money. So, and it does often relate to where it's coming from. So if you are talking to the community investment or the granting part of a company, and that would need to be a bigger company then you know, they might be hanging the decision on their ability to have an impact in certain areas. They probably have pretty clear guidelines around that. They'll say that marketing related to it is not important, although I would argue that that frequently isn't accurate. It is important. If you're talking to small businesses and you're a local charity who's trying to get money from the car dealerships or the local branches of banks or investment firms and things like that, then they're really taking that money out of marketing. So
Dorothy, this one's for you. Your question was if they don't have charitable status, but marketing dollars don't need to have charitable status.
No, exactly. Nonprofit organizations that aren't charities frequently access marketing dollars from businesses, corporations, and local. And frankly, right now, I mean, there's a huge uptick in the number of companies that are actually sponsoring other businesses. You know, for example, you think about things like mompreneur organizations or farmers markets. Most of these are small businesses or bigger businesses, and companies are still sponsoring them because they want the marketing visibility that those organizations are giving. So that's who you're competing with when you're going after marketing dollars. You're competing against not only other charities, but any organization that can deliver that company's message to the people they want it delivered to.
Yeah. So we have granting, which is sort of the philanthropic, like charitable gift. We have sponsorship or marketing, which is more like we want there's a more explicit, I would say, value delivered back. Anything else or like what are some terms that people might hear but not always be familiar with?
Yeah, so there's two others I'll touch on. The elusive cause marketing term, which is a really tough one for all of us because it means very different things to different people. It can be executed in the form of sponsorship. So like we talked about just a few minutes ago, but there can be a myriad of different ways that it actually takes form. And really, it is about a negotiation between the company and the charity where there's a benefit for both. So that could be a sponsorship model where it's on a sponsorship of an event or an initiative, but it could be something that's behind the scenes and the relationship is because of an employee engagement project that's internal to the company and people don't see it externally. So there's quite a lot of different ways that can form.
Totally. And I used to run a big national cause marketing campaign, which had multiple prongs, but some of it was like the customer contribution, right? We all see that, you know, Indigo Winners was our partner. There's like a bazillion, regardless of how you feel about it, it's very present where they're opening up their customer base to access for the charity. But I've also, part of that was an internal, like with one of the banks, they actually had a karaoke night for their staff and everyone raised money. Like the lines are definitely not always straightforward for people.
No, they're not at all straightforward. And I think that's what makes this whole area hard for people and why it isn't for everybody. I mean, when you talk about something like point of sale, which you just mentioned, I mean, that is possible at a very micro level. And when it's designed and negotiated at a very micro level, it's fairly straightforward. But once you get, multiple locations and then it becomes something that really is the purview of a bigger organization. And to be a small organization trying to do that successfully really can take you away from your core mission of doing good work. And you need to determine if you have the capacity to do that. So it is an important one when thinking about cause marketing, to really, know what size and scope of program you are capable of executing against.
Yeah.
I want to mention one other one because it's a funny term that comes up in both sides. I use it a lot, and I hear it reflected back to me, corporate fundraising. And when we talk about corporate fundraising at a charity, we usually mean charity raising money from companies, corporate fundraising. But companies talking about corporate fundraising, they're talking about fundraising, their employees doing fundraising, or their company doing fundraising. So CIBC Run for the Cure, internal to CIBC, they would say, oh, we're doing corporate fundraising because our employees are raising money for breast cancer. So that would be a term that I just want to flag, because you can have a conversation with a company and be using that and be meaning very different things. Yeah. And terminology in these conversations is one of the ways that charities can find themselves at a disadvantage. If they're not feeling comfortable with the terminology that a company is using, then that can really put the conversation into a place that you don't want to be, because you're just not feeling like you got the lingo tight. And I do recommend, as much as possible, being really clear on your lingo when you're talking with the company, so that everybody can, align expectations.
Totally. And also asking, if you're in a conversation with a company, how they think about their contribution. So if they're thinking about it as a philanthropic contribution, you have a much better sense of how that conversation needs to play out, or what they're looking for, versus if you know that they're thinking about this from a marketing perspective, this is a very different conversation. So actually, I guess I want to talk a little bit about this idea of like a hard pitch versus building a relationship. And Heather, I know you have a lot of insights on that as well, especially, I feel like we're getting I want to add so many things, but also, how it compares to major gift fundraising, but we'll come back to that. But just so many clients we work with think that they just have to have their little pitch deck and go in, place it on the table, maybe with a nice presentation, and then wait for an answer. How does it really work?
Yeah, I'll say that I, first and foremost, don't agree with that approach in general. However, if the amount you're asking for is quite small, and small I appreciate as a relative term, but in this case, it almost isn't a relative term. But if you're asking for a small amount of money from a small organization to another small organization, then some form of and I don't want to say pitch deck, because I would go even more simple than that, but like a letter. I mean, when I do hockey fundraising out in Flamborough, we have a 2-page letter that we use, and we max out at $2,000, and most of them are $500, and there's a deep relationship there. That's fundraising, right? That's corporate fundraising, without personalizing it. But if you're talking about getting money from most companies, then starting with the pitch deck means that you've done a whole lot of homework and a whole lot of work before starting the conversation. And I really, really encourage people to start with the conversation and then produce what you need to produce to advance the conversation. So I'm always saying, like, only produce what you need to get to the next point, and then produce that. And that might mean that you're never producing a pitch deck, because if you start with a good conversation, I've had many agreements hatched through email and bullets, and ultimately like a agreement at the end, and there has never been a pitch deck. So starting with a pitch deck really means you're investing a lot of money before you need to, and you may never need to. So that's my
Totally. Totally. Okay, we got a handful of questions. So I'm going to kind of order them based on flow of conversation. So one of the questions is, so how do you identify motivations for giving? And I think this relates to that idea of a conversation and knowing what to put in to, or like what questions to ask as you move things forward.
Yeah. So it's really hard to answer in a general way, but I will try. So what I talk about at the introduction level is your first goal is to have a 15-minute conversation with the person that you believe is going to be able to give you money. And you need to know why you've picked that person. So if the reason is because you know them, then at that point, and they have nothing to do with giving money at that business, then the purpose of that first conversation is to get to know the company and who in the company might be in charge of giving conversation. So your only goal there is, can I talk to you about your company and our charity? And you're going to get on the phone, and all you're trying to do in that call is learn more about what they give money to. So you're going to ask very general questions about, does your company give money to charity? Have they sponsored anything else? Do your employees volunteer? Who's in charge of giving at your organization? Can you introduce me to them, right? And so that's all you're trying to do. If it is the person that's giving money, it depends then if you already know the area that you think you're trying to get money for, and then I might be asking questions around that. And I often say, if they're an event attendee and you're trying to find more about sponsorship, then maybe you have a few questions about the event. What did they like or not like, so you can start to get to know them. But all of it is in the vein of a combination of like extracting information and developing a relationship. One of the mistakes I find happens a lot is we go right to, okay, I'm getting on the phone and these are business people, so I'm going to like business this like nobody's business, right? And the fact is, you talk about your dog or the weather or your recent trip or vacation. You try to make this as warm as possible. And it's not going to work all the time because there is people who are not open to that. But if you find the ones that are, those are the ones that, it's going to become a more fun thing over time to know that you're on the other end of the phone. And it's so much better if they are excited to see your phone number pop up on their display and pick up, because they know they're going to have a fun, enjoyable conversation, a break from their day. And ideally, you're going to deliver something they want as well.
Totally. And like so Olivia's on the line. Hi, Olivia. Volunteer Toronto, I was chatting with them about one of their meetings that a board member set up for them with a corporate partner. And I said, I don't want you to have any, like you can have some leave behind materials, but I want you to ask questions. And the best questions are the ones that are open-ended and understanding. You can ask, here's what people don't understand. Companies want, and the people at companies want to give meaningfully to charities and other nonprofit organizations. And they want that's their job in some cases. So the easier you can make it for them to understand how you fit or don't fit to what their outcomes are, the easier your job will be and their job will be. So you can ask things like, I think with Volunteer Toronto, they ask like, what do you do around volunteering? Why is it important for you? A lot of companies might have posted like areas that they support, but that they're in transition and focusing on new areas. Those are things that come out when you ask questions about their priorities, the impact that they want to have, their hopes, and what a good partnership looks like. So just open-ended, meaningful questions, and don't be afraid to ask, because they'll be really honest. In my experience, I don't know about...
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually have a rule where you're not allowed to introduce your organization until you start with asking them about theirs. So I do often write, so I also say don't bring a document, but if you do, the one you bring is an agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that it can be useful to bring an agenda is because you put introduction, and then the next thing is tell us about your company's priorities in this area or something like that, because they're going to default to asking you about your charity. And if the meetings I've been in are an example, most of you will talk about it for the majority of the meeting, and then we'll try to cram a few questions in the end. If you let them start and describe, then that allows you to respond by telling about the parts of your charity that are relevant to now what they have said. And you can course correct that way. So if they talk about one part of your programming, then you can talk about that. If they talk about an event that they saw, then you can talk about your event. You can then respond in the moment. And I actually, unless it's really critically important to you to leave something behind, I actually don't suggest leaving something behind. And the reason is because
it goes in the garbage.
Well, yeah, it goes in the garbage, but also that's another touch point. And instead of trying to figure out how you can fit all your possible touch points into one meeting, I actually think about how can you make as many touch points as possible out of what you have. So, the 15-minute call, I'm going to listen, I'm going to be smart, and then I'm going to give you the very next best thing I have. Instead of this idea that we're trying to get this done as fast as possible by bringing everything at once, get a decision in that one meeting and be done. And the fact is that rarely works. It definitely doesn't build a relationship. And I know it seems more efficient because you're trying to get through a lot. But the fact is, getting a couple of wins by really focusing on a few strong leads where you really feel there's a good reason is much more effective than trying to scatter oneself across a lot where some of them are really super long shots.
Totally. So let's talk for a minute about identifying those leads. So Jules asked, or sort of commented, sometimes the hardest part is identifying your prospect list, and it really requires research. So how do we start to think about where to find people to talk to?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I have a rule that you should be able to figure out if there's something to talk about or if they're a possible prospect in less than 15 minutes. So I really am reluctant to use the word research because research makes me think that someone's spending a lot of time on this. And if all you need to know is enough to have a 15-minute conversation, then you should be able to do that in a pretty short amount of time. But I do suggest starting with, obviously, like with anything, you want to start with connections that you have through your board or through your network so that you can have a warm intro. But if you can't, then this question of alignment, which I know that you've written about too, Cindy, is what I also recommend. And that's looking for ways that you align on a values basis, on a business priority basis, could be on a grant identification of their guidelines. I mean, so you're looking for a way that you align with the company and using that as the sort of entry point. So know enough about that connection to have a short conversation. That's all you need to do. If they then hang up the phone on you, you haven't wasted an hour of research. If they give you a 15-minute call, then that's a good sign that you should put a little bit more time into the research. And then if after that 15-minute call, it's a positive, then there's time for a lot more research. But you don't need to know a lot to talk for 15 minutes.
Absolutely. I think that's so great. And especially, starting where you have relationships, obviously, but also so we all know, the big banks are always on the top of everyone's corporate list. And Heather, earlier you mentioned sort of smaller or local businesses, which I think is a really interesting place for small nonprofits to play in, because, you know, we all have this shop local movement and stuff like that. And I think that there's a lot of synergies with that and small local charities. So I think that's really.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, I really just suggest that unless you have a relationship and you're dead center of the focus of a big bank, you don't bother, right? Like, it's just, you know, they're done, right? Having said that, almost every local branch of every bank has a budget, and if you can develop a relationship there's anywhere from $500 to $5,000, and then sometimes up to 10 or 15 at the local branch.
Yeah.
So be working that angle, or the retail branch of offices. I've actually worked on multiple national partnerships where we've got the money back at the national level because it has not been given out at the local levels, because the charities locally are not asking local branch offices for the money. They're going straight to the national, and they're getting lost in the granting kerfuffle there, where the branch managers have, you know, discretionary funds. So I do recommend that. And then, of course, even more independent or companies that are in your geography are, you know, really a great prospect because your competition is way lower.
For sure. All right, I'm just coming back to look at the questions. So Duncan, I'm not sure if I is for your first name or Duncan, commented they're a federal nonprofit that gets donations of end-of-life computer technology. So we're looking for more hardware donations from personal and corporate donors. I would argue a lot of this holds true, whether it's in kind or cash. What would you say, Heather?
Yeah. The only thing I can imagine, I would think so too. I mean, obviously, we're talking about, I would think that the difference with in-kind is that there's a system in place at a lot of companies to deal with this. So you're getting them likely to do something harder than they otherwise would do. And so that's how I would be thinking about it. I'd be thinking about what the system is they already have in place and why they should, change that flow. Why should they do something harder than what's currently in front of them, and how are you going to make that worth their while? And be, start with the message of how you're going to make that make that work worthwhile for them.
Yeah. We also had a question. So Olivia asked about current trends in event sponsorship proposals, and specifically what assets can you offer that are most valuable to corporations? How do you compete against potentially similar events?
Yeah. So I do think that this is a funny place where that customization thing comes up a lot, because I see actually what could only be described as full color glossy decks. And in the bottom of the last page, after all the different profiles of how much you pay for different assets are described, the last sentence is we customize proposals. And I'm always like, what part of the last 10 pages looks custom? I mean, if it's a custom proposal, then you're starting talking to them, and what is the most valuable is what they want. So if what they want is an opportunity to talk about something that they're doing, then that's the thing that has to be a part of the proposal. If they want a pop-up shop, then that's the thing. I mean, the trends in what is the most valuable really is connected to who your corporate partner is, because what is valuable to every corporate partner is different, and it depends on what their business is, what they're trying to do. I will say that the expectation around really knowing your audience is getting much higher, and so on the event front particularly, sponsors are expecting you to have a pretty deep understanding of who's going to be at the event and what their what their buying patterns are, what their demographics are, a lot of detail on them. And so they're looking for that, which I know is harder for small charities, but can be achieved through surveys, SurveyMonkey and things like that. It just takes some planning. It's not a cost thing as much as it is a time thing. But that is definitely there.
Yeah. One way to capture that is to send a survey, like an event feedback survey. Mm-hmm. If this is specific to events. So asking people like, how was the event? What was your favorite part? Blah, blah, blah. And then throw in some demographic information, because you'll also get a lot of richness in terms of event feedback.
Yeah. One of the single most important questions too is around, did they remember a company they interacted with? Is that going to lead them to go to that company again? Or, did it change their perception of that company? I mean, those are the kinds of things that the company wants to know. It's, was this worth it? If what they wanted to do was give their company a halo in that community because they've been doing something, nefarious, or if what they wanted was to have everybody at least consider that cell phone company, then, if the charging station, you can't remember who it was, then probably you're not changing your cell phone provider as a result. But if you can remember, maybe the next time you are looking for your cell phone provider, you will go to the company that was sponsoring this charging station. So I do think there's an increased expectation that you're actually going to ask a question that you can go back to them and say, this is why this was a valuable investment.
Excellent. Okay. So a couple questions. Nancy from the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce. Should I target corporations that have shown support for women's entrepreneurship, or those who haven't yet but could benefit from showing that support?
So I'm going to say the first one, under the premise of the people that are inside the tent are easier to get on board and extend their support usually. It's always nice to have a couple of flyers out there where you're like, I know this company would really benefit from my services, but I think it is, that's a tough road to go. So if you are going to go that road, just have really realistic expectations about the time it might take. Because if you're going after somebody who doesn't have a pattern of giving to organizations at all, or organizations like yours, it's going to take an education process. It's going to take time. You're probably going to have to show examples of how it's worked for other organizations that are like theirs, that they may like to be like. So that's not going to be a quick exercise. It may be worth it, but that's where you're really looking at like a year-long communication strategy where you might have to have a case study and you might have to, invite them to a thing or two. And so you're trying to move them from a position of, essentially inaction to action. It's going to be harder.
Yeah. Some of you have heard me say this before, but as a fundraiser, our jobs are not to convince people about the cause, it's to convince them of the organization and our work specifically. So I always use the example of climate change. You're not, as an environmental organization, if you're the fundraiser, your job is not to convince people that climate change is real. It's to find the people who believe climate change is critical right now and that they want to take action and that your organization is the one to support. The caveat I would say, Nancy, is like if you have someone who's reached out to you and wants to have a conversation, or if you have a really warm lead, obviously go for that. But cold soliciting, I totally agree with Heather. All right, so developing corporate responsibility programs for companies. Whoa, this is a whole other topic. I'm keen on taking the approach of being an educator or consultant for prospects so that we enter their space as a subject matter expert rather than an applicant for dollars. This is in relation to, I think, Ian's question. I think you said it was Ian, earlier focused on in-kind donations. So we're more focused on multi-year relationship. And there's a follow-up on multi-year relationships, which I want to separate those two. Let's first talk about this idea of almost like consulting or subject matter expert, and then we'll talk about multi-year.
Sure. So for organizations that have the capacity, I actually do recommend for sponsorship and cause marketing, this is relevant, not for granting so much, but for cause marketing and corporate sponsorship, taking the approach of seeing yourself as a consultant that is providing them not unlike an agency relationship. And I used to say that this at Food Banks Canada, I consider myself the marketing agency of many of the companies that we work with. And I was often in a position of training more junior, new to cause marketing staff at the companies in what we could do together. So I do think that that can be a very helpful and meaningful role to be in, provided you have the time and the capacity to do that, because it does generally mean that you are a corporate cause marketing expert on your side, and that's pretty much all you do, because you need to be able to feed them articles, you need to be planning to see them at conferences, and you have to prove over and over again that is who you are, is that kind of subject matter expert, and then you can develop those kinds of relationships, and it can be very powerful. So if your organization is obviously bigger than a lot of the ones we might be talking to today, and you have that bandwidth, then that is an awesome approach to take. I will say multi-year relationships with corporate are challenging to get. They are possible. They generally come after a non-multi-year relationship. So I haven't seen a ton of examples where companies start with multi-year. Usually they have at least one test grant, I call it, or test sponsorship to see if they like you and how you deliver on the relationship and on the partnership and on the metrics, and then you can, through that time period, negotiate multi-year. So I would caution about being too focused on multi-year out of the gate. I do see that as an expansion of an existing relationship most often.
Yeah, and just to follow up, Bruce, on your question, I think that answers most of it around multi-year giving, and that you said companies are telling you they're frustrated with organizations that call them every few months with another ask. And I would say that's similar to any donor or partner, which is, focusing on stewardship, making sure they feel valued, that they have impact. You can develop those things without a multi-year commitment so that you're better positioned for a multi-year commitment, which I think is basically what Heather just said.
Yeah, and I will say I had lots of relationships where I asked for money multiple times a year, which is totally fine as long as you're doing the other things. And this is one of the places that corporate is the same as major or individual giving that gets lost often, right? There's even more a sense than anywhere else, I think, that you contact companies once a year, you ask for your money, and you go away and deliver the report 12 months later. And that can be further from the truth, right? They don't want to hear from you multiple times a year if all you're going to do is ask for money. But if you have a significant relationship and your reason for connecting is to give them heads up on cool things you're doing and educate them on trends or send them an article that is super helpful to them, then they're happy to hear from you more than once a year. And then you therefore can also ask for money more than once a year if that's the kind of partnership arrangement that you have in place.
Awesome. So Max and Stacy from CPAWS asked, they're national, and one of the challenges that they have with the national conversation is for multinational corporations, those conversations are often had out of the US. And the Canadian offices either might not have the ability to give or just understanding of how the process works. Do you have any tips on that?
So I almost feel like I have to understand the scenario better, but I would say when an initiative is started internationally, it is super important to figure out if you can somehow develop the national version. And certainly, I've worked with a couple of organizations where the initial relationship was established out of the US, and then, there's sort of a lot of work to do to then, figure out what the Made in Canada solution is within the constraints of what's already been negotiated, or figure out if there can be an extension within the Canadian context. So I do encourage you to figure out if there's a way of them introducing you to someone in Canada, and if not, can you reach out to the people in Canada to see if there is an opportunity for you to execute something here? I'm not sure if I'm answering.
Yeah, or almost, yes, and reverse that too. So let's say you have Canadian support, but they don't manage the philanthropic giving or the sponsor. It's probably more likely philanthropic. I imagine they would manage some of the sponsorship on their own. But if most of that's handled out of the US, and the Canadian office might be on board, but not know how to access that money.
Oh.
I think, Max, let me know if that's, here, I'll read the full statement. So as a national NGO, we are often working to develop partners at the national level. One of the challenges we often run into is the community investment is often managed out of the US headquarters, and the Canadian offices don't know the right person or best way to connect with community investment. Do you offer any tips based on your experience? Yeah, okay. So yeah, it's sort of, I'm trying to think if I've had, I mean, if the Canadian person is, if you have a great champion, I would look at how to mobilize them or empower them more so that they can act on your behalf. So help them identify what kind of questions they could ask or who they might be able to ask, because they're still going to get better answers than someone from the outside. Some international companies headquartered in the US with operations in Canada, I have seen just don't give to Canadian charities. That's just, it depends on their age and stage and how long they've been operating in Canada. Or sometimes they might give like millions of dollars to the States, but like 10 grand to Canadian organizations. I've definitely had conversations with companies like that. My suggestion would be like focus on sponsorship, marketing dollars, if that's something they can unlock more readily, or move on and don't waste time if you think that they're never going to get there. So I don't know, that's sort of my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think I'm with you, Sadie. I think it's a question of evaluating the size of the opportunity. I mean, certainly at Food Banks Canada, when we decided we wanted to access the companies that were sponsoring Feeding America, I mean, we got our butts to the US, and we spent a ton of time in places that they were going to be, and with Feeding America directly, which is not an affiliate of Food Banks Canada, just another organization doing similar work in another country. So we put the tactics in place. And I think, one of the things is if you have an intentional idea that you want to execute against, then you have to be intentional about it with corporate. And I kind of equate this to, I know we've talked about this before, around if you have an idea of a certain sector that you think really fits well your organization. So if you're an environmental charity and there's a group of companies that are environmental in nature, and you think that kind of company would be the kind of company that would support us, then putting together a strategy to be where they are and start to develop relationships in a soft way is the kind of thing that I recommend you do, because if it may be a big investment to go to one awards banquet or conference, where your only goal is to just introduce yourself to people so that then you spend the next year or more following up with them. But it gives you a whole new entry point and a new strategy to follow. And if you've been thoughtful about where you put that money and it's not just random, then it can be very worth it. And in this case, if I'm understanding correctly, is it worth it for the time to be invested in connecting with those companies in the US so that you can bring those relationships to Canada? Maybe it is. I'm not saying whether it is or not because I haven't assessed this particular opportunity, but those are the kinds of investments where you have to sort of say, this is a long-term investment to build relationships, to translate to money over time. And sometimes it's worth it.
Yeah. We have about 10 minutes. I'm going to get to a couple of questions. But before we do, I want to make sure we have time, Heather, because you have an awesome little freebie for people that you can download. And also you can get onto Heather's mailing list because she is a wonderful person to get information from on a regular basis, especially if A, you found this helpful, and B, you think this is an area of growth for your organization. So Heather, do you want to pop that in the chat? Just the URL?
Yeah, for sure.
So people can make sure they download it. And then give us like a 1 minute, or I was going to say 2 seconds, that's too short, like overview of what they can download.
Sure. So as we said at the beginning, I've named my company. I have a website. So I've been a consultant now for 2 years, but just launched my website in the last little while. And yay! I was so busy working with all my awesome clients over the last couple of years, which has been so fun, that the task of writing about it didn't happen. But the fact of the matter is it's ready now. So I'll put in the chat, www.bridgeraise.com. So like fundraise, but I'm bridging people and connections and all that kind of thing. So bridgeraise.com. My first download right now, if you sign up, is a top 10 list of best partnership tips. As you mentioned, I also have a template, blogs I send out about once a month, maybe get a little bit more than that, but around once a month. And I do have one that relates to what we've talked about today about that introductory email and first meeting. So that's coming up in the next few weeks. So very timely that the agenda and some of the questions we talked about today are on that one that's coming in the next few weeks. So I try to send out things that are helpful. I have one blog that's up there that you alluded to, and I think a few of these people should read maybe. That's shifting your mindset from major gift fundraising to corporate fundraising and what that looks like. So some different tips up there. And of course, there's a contact form. If you have a question you want to ask me directly, then you can email me through my website or through any number of ways, and I'll do my best to answer. Awesome.
So I put the URL in.
There, okay.
But if there's a specific one, I know there's a pop-up, but if there's a specific sign up for the blog or for the download, just add that there. But yeah, definitely you guys want to get on this. And while you do that, so there's another question, a couple questions that we'll try to get through. That's probably all we'll have time for, but feel free to reach out to Heather or I with anything else, and we'll try to cover it in blog posts or further master classes. So if a corporate partner is in a pledge for a capital campaign and the stewardship touch points were all followed through, is it advisable to ask for another major gift while they're in pledge for their capital gift?
I don't know.
Favorite answer, it depends. I will say, like, if they've been giving their annual sponsorship and then they made a capital gift on top of that and their annual gift is up for renewal, but they've been giving at both, then definitely see if you can renew them. If they stopped their annual gift to make a capital gift, then, I mean, you can ask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think this depends on how strong the relationship is. And I'd start at the point of a conversation, right? Like
Yeah.
if you have something new that you're talking about, I might be thinking like, some of the ways I might address it is if there's an opportunity that's new and you want to say first right of refusal. I wanted to make sure you had this chance, maybe something like that. Or another one might be like just testing it. I would test it with a kind of question like that. We have this new thing. Wanted to make sure as one of our big partners that you had first right of refusal, but I know you're in campaign or whatever, like something like that. I think I would try something like that if you really felt that it was a good opportunity to ask for more. A lot would depend on how it was set up. And if you weren't around for the setup, then, you might be able to fall on that as well and say, I'm not sure if you expected to hear from me during this pledge period, but, I wasn't here for the setup. So I'm talking to you about it. Something like that, maybe.
All right. One more question. So can you please clarify your answer around entering a corporate space as a consultant and how it's connected to cause-related marketing? So perhaps you are aligning yourself with the subject/issue and company has the same interest. So I'm going to take a quick step. So I don't actually see the connection between the consulting and the cause marketing. I'm not sure. So I want to give an example and then we can maybe talk more. I guess it depends. But so for example, one organization that I've worked with in the past called White Ribbon works to engage men and boys in ending violence against women. I'm sure a number of you know them. They started a consulting arm of their organization that's called Parker P Consulting, and that's all they do. So they sort of separated that function because there were enough companies that needed to change their internal culture around that issue. They needed the education and they had budget for that. And so it wasn't philanthropic, it wasn't sponsorship, it truly was a consulting relationship. That's like, I think I think it would be helpful to understand what kind of consulting relationship you're thinking of. I can't remember who asked the original question.
So the only thing I would say is what I meant in that particular context is, when I said it, so if this is the question, is as a fundraiser in a shop, like a director of fundraising or something, most people have an approach they take with companies that is very different from how a corporate consultant would approach a company. Or in the case of, there's a ton of marketing companies who are building campaigns, cause marketing campaigns for a company, and then it raises money for the charity, and the charity gets what's left over after the marketing company has taken their cut. So at Food Banks Canada, we tried to position ourselves as able to do that whole thing. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, and that's where I said it takes capacity. So it's definitely not a small shop approach, but we had people like me, and my whole job was to deliver cause marketing with corporations, and therefore had a different level of sophistication around what was possible than most people who are working in fundraising at smaller shops, because that's all I did. Yeah. Now, that is not, to me, a practical approach for most charities. It is the right approach for many big charities, and that's how many big charities get into the space where they can really take the place of a marketing agency for a company.
Yeah, so it's almost like there's two approaches, but depending on what you mean by what is meant by consulting, because what Heather is talking about is basically she became the expert on corporate giving that the companies had access to help make sure that they were most effective and aligned in their giving as part of their relationship with the charity. But there's also like nothing like fee for service consulting on a subject that your charity might be involved in or be an expert on that has nothing to do with leveraging or accessing their charitable support. That's more like a fee for service, which is the Parker P model. So those are kind of different different ways to think about consulting, I guess. And it really depends, like it obviously depends on your organization and the value, like what you think you can provide to organizations. But look up Parker P if you're in Toronto and you want an example of that sort of fee for service. They're the ones I can.
That's a great model. That's more, to me, that's more like a social enterprise model, which is a bit different than, which is super smart.
Yeah. Have to say thank you. We got to wrap. But thank you to everyone. Thank you, especially Heather. That was so helpful. I'm sure we would have tons more questions if we had time. But I know you covered so much and very practical stuff. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been fun seeing everyone's names and faces pop up here, and I look forward to hearing from some of you, I hope. But I am on Twitter, LinkedIn, bridgeraise.com. I'm all over the place, so don't hesitate to follow up with me if you have a question after today.
Amazing. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.